Here we go. Well, welcome, Charlotte. I'm really delighted that you could join me today on our next interview in the series. And I really this time wanted to talk about the nature of communities. I think we've seen this massive stepping up of, I suppose, stepping up or stepping into the problem by local communities in this sort of vacuum of the NHS and national government not being able to respond to local needs. And so in that spirit, I talked to you obviously many times, but most importantly, a year ago on our inquiry into asset-based health. And I suppose what we're seeing is an absolute opportunity for asset-based health models. And it comes with some problems and some advantages, but I thought this would be a good time to think, as we're thinking about proactive leadership into the future, how is it that we build resilient, capable communities? How do we work with communities in an asset-based model? But Charlotte, maybe you could introduce yourself a little bit first.
Yes, so my name's Charlotte. I'm Chief Executive at National Voices. National Voices is a coalition of health and care charities. We've got about 150 members, large and small. Some of the really big ones you will have heard of, the British Heart Foundation and Macmillan Cancer Support and the Alzheimer's Society. Lots of really small ones who are volunteer-led, and then a whole chunk in the middle that are often condition-specific and look after one health condition, but also some cohort-specific ones. We've got like one that looks after homeless health and one that looks after young people's mental health and so on. Yes, and I've obviously, since this all kicked off, worked very extensively with members on what they're hearing on the helplines. Their kind of the demand for their information and support has gone completely through the roof, exactly at the time that their funding is going off a cliff. So it's a really precarious situation for the sector right now, which keeps us busy, and we're trying to translate some of the stuff that our members are telling us about their beneficiaries' lives to decision makers.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to, you may know that we've been doing this survey of the NHS, and so this is about, the respondents are probably about 60% primary care and the majority are clinicians. And one of the sections, I suppose, that came up in this survey was this issue around communities, collaboration and support. And these were some of the quotes from that survey, and I picked sort of three that really stood out for me. One was, the pace at which, as you can see, particularly general practice here, has managed to reach out to its community and get support from the community, but also this extraordinary, I suppose, a recognition of the extraordinary ability of communities. Now, I know, Charlotte, that we've got communities that have got the capacity and the energy to do that, and we have got communities that are devastated by the pandemic. I understand those differences. But this survey is about what sticks. And you and I have talked over years about the difficulty the NHS has with co-production, the difficulty it has in reaching out, the difficulty it has in understanding the assets of the community. We've got these nuggets now. We've got these potential new relationships. Do you think this can stick?
I think this is obviously a massive opportunity that we mustn't waste for this to stick, but there's also quite the same size risk that it won't. I think we can't take for granted that it will stick. I think what is clear now to anyone looking at health is that health is not generated inside the health system, and that how we behave, every one of us in our lives outside the health system, has a massive impact on the health system. So if we needed reminding of that, it's here. So this, in a nutshell, us behaving in this way or in that way, overwhelming the NHS or helping the NHS to cope, is true every day of the year and has been true for 3 years and 10 years. It's much crasser now, obviously, it's very clear. But what's also very clear is that how we live is not entirely down to the choices we make, and that how we live is very much to do with how overcrowded is our housing, how deregulated is our employment relationship, and what do we believe to be true about our own health status and the world. And those things are obviously very socially bounded and not all about are you making good or bad choices. So we have experienced this now in such a tangible way that I think we could hope that we hang on to this learning. But I think there's always the tendency for a statutory service under pressure to turn inwards. And I think that is a kind of reflex we have seen over the years with health and social care and so on, and to try to respond to what they experience as being overwhelmed by rationing what's available. And to an extent that has happened now. We have, we represent and work with 15 million people having long-term conditions, and those long-term conditions haven't gone away, and their care has been massively rationed in order for us to enable this COVID response. Now, that was probably necessary, but I think it's really important that we don't forget that sacrifice that was made. And people have cancer, and people who are waiting for joint replacements, and people who have mental health needs, and people who are waiting for other procedures are waiting in vain at the moment, and that's obviously all health needs that's not met. But I think we need to kind of gently remind our colleagues inside the NHS and inside social services and inside councils how they got through this period, and how they only got through this period by strong relationships and strong networks of actors and creativity and improvisation. And if we could rescue some of that into the next period, it's easier to do this obviously when money is no object. And I think people have experienced this now, and it showed how much the austerity thinking had boxed in our ability to be creative and to improvise, and how it had damaged the ability of our leadership to do the right thing. And if you take away the austerity parameter, of course, people who lead in the NHS and who lead for councils want to do the right thing by the populations they serve, and it enables them to make creative, problem-based, solution-based decisions. But I think we need to sort of put some conscious energy and effort into trying to remember these situations and gently remind our NHS colleagues of this, maybe as we move out of this hyper-acute phase. What have we learned? What do we want to hang on to? And I don't quite know how we enable this learning. I'm pleased to hear that you're trying to kind of collate some of this, but we need to think about what's the tone of voice and body language almost we need to adopt with our colleagues, because they're knackered, aren't they, and traumatized and depleted to an extent when we come out of this very, very acute phase. And how can we help them?
I suppose so, but
realize they can rely on us?
I mean, one of the things so there's been back to the survey, and these, some people recognize parts of this survey, some people don't, some people can see the benefits of the community, some people struggle. With the quotes I gave you were obviously phenomenal. But actually, I think, and some people going, Becky, have you been in an ICU? We're panicked. That's not shown in your survey. I said, but I'm asking you what's worked, because if it's worked in 10 places, 100 places, 500 places, but actually at this time, the potential to spread learning is bigger, because we're now in a learning system in a way we haven't been before. So what you're seeing is people, I'm not talking about national politicians, I'm talking about clinicians on the ground, seeking each other out, trying to find out what's worked, sharing learning, questioning how they're understanding. And that sort of network of learning has just been fabulous. So I think there's something about that, and something about, there is some hope, there are some potentials. What you were saying, our work on people who turn up frequently in general practice, 40% of those people are struggling with life. And that's nothing that a GP appointment can ever do. And actually, maybe they might be able to reach out and find that there are some other solutions to that, or at least general practice can work out, perhaps, and learn that being vulnerable and asking for help is one way that, we're in it together, properly in it together. Health is not something that a GP or a hospital doctor fixes. It has to be a collaboration. And that shift of power, that shared vulnerability, that sense of unknown together, I think has potentially really shifted the relationship, and that has to stick, I think, if we're going to do that.
And I think where people close to the ground have either been empowered or just empowered themselves to make decisions and not wait for central edicts and guidelines and money flows. I think, I've just my gut feeling and, anecdotally, people have got off the ground so quickly. Councils got food help to people so quickly, not waiting for the central government parcel and not waiting for that whole thing. And I can see that in the people that we work with, people with long-term conditions, people with vulnerabilities, how front-footed they were as this came over the horizon. And as, maybe people felt the government were very slow in saying we need to stay in and we need to stop socializing, people kind of almost preempting those decisions locally and for themselves because they were networked, because they talked to people with lung transplants in China, they did. And they then figured out what they needed to do. And I think there is something there we can learn about not waiting for permission. Like, the other side of that coin is that young woman I think it was in Luton, who worked for the NHS and died, heavily pregnant. She was delivered of a baby and then died. The baby's alive.
Absolutely tragic.
She was working in a patient-facing role, and yes, she wasn't working on a COVID ward, but whatever that means at that point, during April, every ward is, potentially got COVID patients on it. And I just couldn't help but think this person had a line manager. This line manager had an HR department. What were they waiting for? If I was responsible for someone who was heavily pregnant, I would think she mustn't look after patients right now. She needs to be in a role where she's less in contact with people. So where people have waited for central edicts, because I remember people saying afterwards, oh, we weren't instructed by the NHS leadership to take pregnant women off the front line. I was just thinking, why were you waiting for that instruction?
I mean, we've talked a little bit earlier on about class and our feudal world, and we're the most centralized democracy in the Western world. And in many respects, I think the Lansley reforms, the contracting reforms, infantilized senior people, paid a lot of money in terms of their decision-making process. You can't move without waiting. And so suddenly it's flipped on its head. And I think the boards of any organization, NHS organization, are going to be really thinking about what ethical decision-making means, which is ethical decision-making in those situations. You crowdsource almost the response. You go get data, you work it out for yourselves. And I don't underestimate the difficulty that in any situation, anybody making any decision. But I do understand culturally the norms that are very endemic, which are not endemic in, you see bits of it, don't you, in the third sector, some of the difficulty in letting go. But the difficulty in having and grasping power and saying no, it has been really, really astronomical. I'm going to share with you actually, Charlotte, just back to some of the quotes that you said to me during the inquiry, because I think these were really, really important. And I think these do speak to some of these underlying perceptions that could get in the way of us this sticking. So this was one of them: communities don't tend to spontaneously combust into resilience. I mean, just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I just think when I came and talked to you, or when we talked together during that inquiry, I was a little bit frustrated at the sort of polarization of the debate about asset-based community development, where some people were saying we need to have clear blue water between communities and services are what destroy communities ultimately, and it's all the paternalistic model and it destroys self-reliance. And I just sort of think, really, I mean, services are obviously parts of the assets that communities can draw on and should be allowed to draw on. So I have a strong sense that we can't just sort of sit back and say, oh, if communities are the solutions, then we need to let communities figure this out themselves, because there's strong evidence now, and NAV have documented this, and New Philanthropy Capital, I think recently have kind of shared a data set that showed the more deprived communities are, the weaker their BCSE is, so the very deprived communities often do not have access to strong advocacy and community organizations that can argue their case and their corner. So I do think we need to build bridges between the statutory sector and services and the state and whatever that means, and communities, especially when there's distrust. And one of the terrible, terrible dimensions of this is how badly affected Black and minority ethnic communities seem to be. And I do think there's something there about trust.
Yeah.
And how could it be any other way? We've had hostile environment. We have, people being unsure about their immigration status during the time the Windrush drama unfolded and all of that. And we can't just expect these communities to download a government app that traces all their movements. It's just fanciful to imagine that this is how this will pan out. If we want information and behavior advice in the hands of these communities, we need bridging organizations, and we need spokespeople who are trusted.
Step into. So I'm also intrigued about the nature of being in it together. And communities identify at the level that communities identify. You can't tell a community it's a community. I love this when they put the primary care networks in and said you have to work with and build social prescribing for your community. It's not your community. You're a product of the community. But I wonder whether there's ways of networking communities together, which is that this is the first time. So communities will look after themselves at one level, or can, or at least have a network and a potential. But we've seen other communities as other. So our neighbouring communities, and I wonder whether actually the interdependence of the pandemic, which is if there's an infection in one community, given that we don't have any way of testing, it's likely to move into another. And so actually we have this link that we may not have seen before, and we haven't wanted to see, because, my wealth is somebody else's poverty. So it's very, very hard to face that, isn't it, as an individual? But I wonder whether not only is it about statutory sectors and third sectors reaching into these communities, I wonder whether it's other communities reaching into these communities.
Yeah, I think it could go that way, and wouldn't it be fantastic if it did? I also think it could go the other way, though. We've seen othering around the infection risk, and when Ramadan started, I saw all sorts of nasty stuff kicking off around how these people aren't going to isolate and how these people are going to trample all over the restrictions. And then we see, a whole bunch of white people celebrating VE Day and no one raises an eyebrow. So I just think we can't assume that these things will just gel in that beautiful way.
But in the same way you say here.
Yeah, and I think that this is something we need to fight for. This is something we need to argue for, isn't it? And I do think the state has a role also in leveling the playing field. So, in my community, there's just one old lady who needs, on my micro community, our block, who needs some help from people. And so we've reached out and helped her. But if she was horrible, if she was, a drinker or a racist, or, we might not, we might just be a bit like, let's not talk to her, and then there is the role of the state to be a leveler, to say everybody's entitled to something, to a food parcel, to a visit by a volunteer, to a phone call, to medicines. The kind of minimum standard needs to be an entitlement, in the way that you're not entitled to your neighbors putting their arms around you, but it's obviously really important that it does happen. But we can't assume it reaches everyone. It might not reach the unpleasant people we know or don't know, but who live in our neighborhood. So I really am keen, and I think that's the point I was trying to stress when we spoke last about this, not to make up these false dichotomies between, communities can do this beautiful stuff and the state gets in the way. It's like, it's not quite like that, isn't it? We have seen now the power of the state. No one else could have stepped in and foot the national wage bill. No one else could have stepped in and said, we reform sick pay. No one else could have stepped in and said, we protect private tenants. We take the homeless off the street and put them in hotels. I think one thing also we need to kind of step back and learn is that the state is a powerful, powerful mechanism for changing the course of society.
That sort of begins, this is another quote, and it speaks to that too, this national, how do we generate reciprocity when when within that othering? So what does it take to support each other? What do we need to be in a space where we step in and step out? And I think some of that is about people feeling that it's worth it, that it's worthy. It's very interesting, just in my local community, both in terms of the scrub sewing, which I was telling you about, people feeling, not it's just they were sewing scrubs for the NHS, but it's been really good for me. I feel like I'm taking a role in society. I'm not a needy, dependent person that everyone's just getting food for. I'm doing something for my community, and that need to give is so important. And somehow we always see people as being needy and having, you know, back to the demand-led NHS rather than the needs-led NHS. And when we talk about needs, it's needs we're going to fulfill rather than understanding needs together and then say, what can each of us give? And that peer collaboration, reciprocity sense, that's quite a different dynamic. It's a different dynamic from the, you're not, you shouldn't come to A&E. You're making very bad decisions. I'm going to stick a poster in a bus stop and tell you not to come in A&E because you're daft, rather than
Only now
why are you coming to A&E?
Only now we're putting posters onto backs of buses saying, do come to A&E if you've got a stroke or a heart attack.
I know.
You misunderstood us.
You misunderstood, yeah, exactly.
I mean, I even see that in the sort of highly professionalised, highly paid London middle class, where a lot of people suddenly found themselves with time on their hands because they were furloughed or, you know, weren't working quite so much. And how much people felt the urge during this crisis time to feel like they were making a contribution. I think that's driven a lot of the sign up to the NHS Volunteer app. And, you know, we've got people volunteering for us at National Voices who are very expert. You know, I've got a video editor volunteering for us, and he's saying, I keep shoving work to him and saying, oh, I'm sorry, is this too much? And he's like, no, I love it. It reminds me why I wanted to do this job, you know, why I wanted, what the power of a good video and how you can tell someone's story. And I just really think when this kicked off, it felt so extraordinary and so dangerous and uncertain that almost everyone had the sense that they needed to reach out to someone else to make that connection, to do something useful, to make things better for someone. And I mean, that's just beautiful, isn't it? Because we have been sort of talking to ourselves as if we're all just business people who are kind of looking at the bottom line, and clearly we're not.
No, that's very nice, actually. That's sort of,
you know, we're social beings who want to feel like we are contributing to the greater good.
Maybe that is the work of the middle classes, which is we have been gifted this time to think. It's time to think about our purpose. We are leaders in the world, in our world. You know, you can. We can watch the devastation that's happening in other communities, but we have a responsibility to think about what it is we need to do. What is our work? What is our work?
Yeah, I spoke to someone in one of the big consultancies. They shall remain nameless, but you know which ones they are. You know, the ones who get all the contracts out of the NHS. And she was saying the team who are doing no work at the moment are the people who look at sort of litigation around insurance claims and all of that, because that has to all wait and then it'll all kick off. And I was saying, well, then they're going to be very busy. And she said, yeah, but a lot of them will have changed tack by then, because they're sitting there right now and they're looking at their careers and they're looking at the situation and they're going, really? Is that how I want to spend my life? You know, I think there's really something there about, it's reminded all of us a little bit of the fact that we only have this small lifespan, and that we are at our happiest and at our most fulfilled if we connect that life we have with the lives other people have, I think.
This last quote, which was sort of the transactional world that we were in before, which is, you know, communities an empty space. We have to go in there and sort them out. And whereas we're learning, aren't we? We're observing that actually meaningful work, meaningful lives is important for everybody, and there's meaning across the whole. It isn't just in predefined job roles or societal roles. There's much more to it than that.
Definitely. And sometimes the best thing a service can do is to remind the people that you're providing the service to that they have a contribution to make. You know, the good models I see in the sector, in my sector, in the third sector, in the voluntary sector, are models that move away from the I do something to you and then you are grateful and then somehow I expect you magically to move on, which never quite happens, to I help you see what it is you can do, and I support you, and I won't let you just sink or swim, but I will, between us, we figure out what it is that you are going to contribute. And I challenge and support you to be a person in life who makes a contribution. And I think the people we've locked into benefit claims and sickness absence and endless service use who we've deprived of this. But it's also the kind of high flyers. It's the people who chase the, you know, the profits who we've deprived of this in a way.
Then I suppose the place I want to sort of end on, which does really think about some of these inequalities, but also this sense of meaning that, you know, are the stories we know, the data we know about social connections. The more social connections you have, the more healthy you are, the less you tend to use services. But social connections are not equally available to all, and they're not always great. You know,
No.
So how do we, if we believe that to be true, and we've evidence that that's true, and we've begun to see some rise in social connections, and maybe between people who might not have been socially connected before, is it all good?
Well, you know, I was thinking of my friend and colleague Kate Jobling, who's worked on like loneliness and that sort of stuff for many years, and she's explained to me, and I think that's a very good way of looking at it, that there's two types of connections we tend to have, and resilient people have both. One is the very private, very kind of, I help my sister-in-law. When she has young babies, I'll cook for her. If my mother-in-law needs to be taken to hospital, I'll do that. And that's often very strong and deprived communities that don't do a lot of formal volunteering, but there's an awful lot of taking care of each other, very practical support inside your community going on. But you also need the wider connections. Your little community, your family needs connections to the job center, to a good college, to good jobs, good work. And if those connections miss, then again, you're not very resilient. And I think that's a very helpful way to think about what goes on right now. And we're depriving a lot of people of that intimate network of relationships. So those people who live on their own but would have normally relied very heavily, let's say, on adult children or, you know, relatives to come and support them, they are very stuck, I think, with loneliness, and they will need some help to come out of that shell again that we've created for them. But then there's also the need for people to be connected into communities that entitle them to something, and communities that enable them to move on and to move out and to choose their own path in life. And if that misses, then again, communities become very locked in. And I think some of those hotspots of carrying the highest burden of morbidity and mortality has occurred in those communities where it's overcrowded and, you know, a deprived high street and very few opportunities, and people end up with very precarious jobs. And really, if this has taught us something, is that we can't afford to live like this. Everybody needs to have access to the kind of infrastructure of opportunity that an organized society needs to provide.
So we've got some work to do, both in learning the lessons, in you know, being able to, I suppose, observe what's happening, amplify what's happening, think about some of these underlying relationships that we need, some of those underlying conditions, some of the responsibility we all have for our interdependence as we move into the next stage of being alert.
I think we have to learn that we can't see the whole world. No one can see the whole world, but the whole world can be known, and everybody can see their bits. And we need to learn to see other people's bits, really. And we make dangerous decisions if we assume we can see the whole world, if we assume we know what goes on in East Ham or Newham or Barnet. We don't, unless we have a foot on the ground. We are at National Voices collating people's experiences through this initiative called Our COVID Voices, where everybody can tell their story, particularly people living with health and care needs, because we feel their experience has really been kind of brushed under the carpet. We got, you know, all the health professionals deployed on COVID wards, and it's wonderful what has been made possible, but those people were doing jobs before, looking after people with endometriosis and knee pain and mental ill health. And what, you know, what are those experiences people have, and how can we do the right thing by them. I think it's really important that we hear those experiences. That's our contributions, but other people also, I think, need to put in some effort, especially those in positions of power, to understand what is it like to shield if we decide to extend shielding. What is it like to look after a disabled child if we continue with no availability of respite care? You know, it's like we need to understand other people's realities.
Well, I wanted to show people where they can find it if they want to join in and share some of their stories. Thank you, Charlotte. Always an absolute pleasure, and it's
Same
just
here.
great to spend a bit of time really deeply on one aspect.
I agree. I
really hope we can make the most of it, because I think it has phenomenal potential for us individually and collectively. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Speak soon.